Right, we now start with questions to Secretary of State for Defence, Alyn Smith.
Number one, sir.
Minister.
Good afternoon, Mr Speaker. The Department's priority is to finalise entry into the PESCO military mobility project before considering involvement in other projects. However, we assess that the EU standard third country terms for PESCO projects involving procurement or capability development will continue to impose a significant constraint on UK involvement.
Alyn Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful for the answer. I appreciate that the UK Government's attitude to PESCO is to take each project on a case-by-case basis. But could I suggest that publishing some criteria about what that case-by-case basis assessment is based upon would be really useful? Because it's obvious to the dogs in the street that PESCO is going to evolve at light speed, and the UK risks missing out on a lot of really important cooperation that could be really beneficial. So could the Minister publish that guidance? Otherwise, I'll be putting down 68 parliamentary questions to cover each of the 68 mechanisms that PESCO has.
Hear, hear.
Well, Mr Speaker, I note the honourable gentleman's suggestion, and I fear that my answer will give him encouragement to table the 68 questions, because I think it is right that we consider each opportunity within PESCO on its merits. Very obviously, PESCO as a vehicle for increasing military mobility around the continent is something that non-EU NATO partners support fully, and the UK is within that. But when it comes to industrial or technological cooperation, it won't always be in the UK interest or in the interests of UK industry. And so I think it's right that we consider these things on a case-by-case basis.
Clive.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The issue of support for you. Question 2.
Minister.
Speaker, during his visit to Ukraine on the 12th of January, the Prime Minister signed a historic UK-Ukraine agreement on security cooperation with President Zelensky, illustrating our long-term commitment to support Ukraine. The Prime Minister has announced that the UK will provide £2.5 billion in military aid to Ukraine in 24-25, a £200 million increase on the previous 2 years to cover rapid procurement and gifting of equipment, development of international capability coalitions and training through Op-Interflex.
Clive.
I thank the Minister for that response. There's clearly widespread support in this House and in the country for helping Ukraine resist Russian aggression. But concerns that President Zelensky has recently identified a shortage of both arms and ammunition, particularly with regard to the impasse in the US Congress. So what discussions has the Minister had with his counterparts in the EU and other European nations to help bridge that gap in the short term, and about how you would deal in the longer term if the election of President Trump reduced spending on NATO in general and Ukraine in particular in the longer term?
Well, Mr Speaker, of course we are aware of the scepticism both amongst Republican presidential candidates but also in Congress over funding for Ukraine. That is why UK ministers, the Foreign Secretary, the Secretary of State, myself, Prime Minister, have all been in Washington to make the case for the US continuing to support Ukraine no matter what the outcome of the election. Now, second-guessing the US electoral system is probably not that sensible, but it is clear that European manufacturing capacity as it is, notwithstanding the fantastic efforts led by Prime Minister Kallas in Estonia to increase manufacturing of ammunition particularly, have not yet got even to half of the target that they set. And this should be a cause for all of us to consider how we might urgently ramp up manufacturing if the worst would come to the worst.
Chair of the Select Committee, Jeremy Quin.
Ukraine can win this war and must win this war. The provision of ammunition and equipment the Minister has touched on, but Ukraine also needs hundreds of thousands of trained personnel. Very much welcome the extension of Interflex and the work that we're doing. But is that not something our allies and ourselves could be doing far more to assist them on?
Well, Mr Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is right to point to the importance of the training effort, and it gives me the opportunity to reflect on this week being the 10-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Crimea, and that event gave rise to the beginning of Operation Orbital, and that since then, across Orbital and Interflex, 60,000 Ukrainian troops have been trained. Continuing to train them as individuals, but increasingly as formations, is undoubtedly the key to unlocking the real potential of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Ian Blackford.
Thank Mr. Speaker. We've all seen the events over the last few days in Ukraine with the Russian offensive. This must act as a wake-up call to all of us. This is our problem. This is our fight with Ukrainians to defeat Putin. We need to make sure that we step up the ammunition and the arms that we're shipping to Ukraine now. We need to do that with our European partners, and we need to have a plan, not just for the short term, but for the long term, so we defeat Putin. So what talks is the Minister and the Cabinet Secretary having with the European allies to make sure that Ukraine wins this war?
Well, Mr. Speaker, these conversations happen all the time. Only last week, the Secretary of State was at the latest of the donor conferences, followed by NATO defence ministers. I was in Norway a week or so beforehand, having exactly these conversations with allies. The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right that the sort of traditional armaments like artillery ammunition are important, but so too, increasingly, are novel precision weapon systems that the UK is very much at the forefront of providing to our Ukrainian friends.
So Julian Lewis.
Is it not time that both sides of this House came together to agree on a common policy of increasing defence expenditure so that by increasing our support for Ukraine, we can set an example to our American allies without whose help there is no future for peace and security in Europe?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my colleagues on the opposition front bench know that I try not to throw gratuitous punches in the House, and I know that they are enthusiasts for military spending, but their colleague, the Shadow Chancellor, has thus far declined to say that she will do anything other than the 2% target on NATO spending, which is not the same as the government is currently spending, nor what the government currently intends to increase spending to. So the right honourable gentleman's suggestion is timely, and it would be fantastic if over the course of the next hour the right honourable Shadow Secretary of State were to make the same commitment as we have.
Let's try now then. Shadow Secretary of State John Healey.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, in the last Labour year of the last government, we were spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, a level that's never been matched in any of the 14 Tory years since. Mr. Speaker, the Labour leader and I were at Munich, like the Defence Secretary at the weekend, and the urgency of more help for Ukraine ran through every discussion. And everyone was also profoundly moved by Yulia Navalny, speaking even after the news of her husband's death at Putin's hands. This is the brutality the Ukrainians are fighting. This is why UK support must not falter. So we strongly back last month's UK-Ukraine security agreement. The Defence Secretary calls it a 100-year alliance. So will the government take the necessary next step with an implementation plan for this year and future years to make sure Ukraine gets the help it needs now and for tomorrow?
Well, Mr. Speaker, whilst grateful for the history lesson on what was spent under the previous Labour government, the commitment to match the government's spending in a future government was conspicuously absent from the right honourable gentleman's answer. However, back to the collegiate spirit within which defence questions is normally conduct himself, I absolutely agree that the horizon the Secretary of State set out in his speech for the partnership with Ukraine absolutely requires a strategic approach to be taken with very long horizons set for what our cooperation, both industrial and military, could look like.
Sean Healey.
Well, long horizons are fine, but Ukraine needs more help now. And I'm concerned about this 2.5 billion for Ukraine, announced last month and described by the Prime Minister, as the Minister says, as the biggest single package of defence aid to Ukraine since the war began. In an answer to my question last week, however, the Minister would not rule out using this money to cover the UK's own operational costs at NATO bases. So will he today rule that out? Will he today confirm that every penny and every pound of this 2.5 billion for Ukraine will go to Ukraine?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman, I fear, has missed something over the last 2 years, because the 2.3 billion that the government has provided in support of operations to support Ukraine has always included both the gifting in kind that takes the headlines, but also Operation Interflex and other avenues through which we support the Ukrainians. So the fact is that next year's spending and the year after will match exactly what we did in previous years in terms of the breadth of that contribution. It's also true, Mr. Speaker, that both the long-term strategic alliance that the Secretary of State set out and the commitment year on year to spend more than any other European ally are not mutually exclusive. We're doing both.
SNP spokesperson Martin Docherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, on the 17th of March at the Munich conference, Prime Minister Frederiksen of the Kingdom of Denmark actually stated, if you ask a Ukrainian, they're asking for ammunition now, artillery now. From the Danish side, we decided to donate our entire artillery. Doesn't the Secretary of State agree, or at least the Minister, that allies should be a little more like Denmark when it comes to recognising the consequences of not meeting Ukraine's needs?
So, Mr. Speaker, we're full of admiration for our Danish colleagues, but the reality is that the UK has provided almost its entire heavy artillery capability in terms of AS-90. Those that we've held behind are those that service the battle group in Estonia and the very high readiness armoured battle group. Similarly, we've been generous with our ammunition stocks whilst retaining those that we need for our VHR forces. More than that, we've catalysed the production of 155mm ammunition in the UK, and even further, we have been buying up as much 152 and 122mm ammunition around the world as we possibly can. The UK's contribution to the Ukrainian artillery fight is not confined to what we had within our own ammunition stockpiles. It is much, much bigger and amounts to hundreds of thousands of rounds.
Martin Docherty-Hughes.
Well, I'm afraid I have to say, Mr. Speaker, to paraphrase a former member, the government's response, I think, is weighted in the balance and found wanting. So with the Czech Republic's profound donations of artillery and shells on top of the Danish donation, as well as a commitment of over 1 million from the EU, I wonder if the Minister, and I hope he can come up to the dispatch box and correct the balance and advise the House in terms of his new investment, and it is welcome, in terms of the new investment, how much of that is in tactical armaments and in artillery?
So the overseas ammunition acquisition plan from previous years remains broadly as it was, which amounts to about 300,000 rounds bought on international markets and provided to Ukraine. The 155mm manufacture acceleration is subject to a different funding package that the Secretary of State and his Ukrainian counterpart have been working on. But it's important to note, Mr. Speaker, that the 200 million additional money from last year to this is focused on the provision of drones, and it is those tactical drones that are proving to be most significant in terms of the impact they're having in the battle space.
Scott Benton.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the latest full-time strength of the Army is 73,520. The Army is continuing to work towards its future soldier structure of 73,000 regular and 30,000 reserve personnel. There are no current plans to change this. And good news, Mr. Speaker, provisional figures suggest that January had the highest number of Army applications for 6 years.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Media reports have suggested that white men have been actively discriminated against in recruitment and that security checks may be relaxed due to promoting ethnic diversity within the Army. A number of senior military figures have purportedly warned that the pervasiveness of woke ideology being pushed onto the armed forces is a real and present threat to national security and will give aid and comfort to the King's enemies. Will the planned review of diversity policies seek to address these concerns?
Well, I'm very grateful for the honourable gentleman's remarks. I don't recognise the situation he describes. We take security extremely seriously and ensure all personnel have security clearance appropriate to their job. Checks normally require at least 3 years UK residency, but Commonwealth candidates are permitted to accrue qualifying residency while serving, although they cannot take up roles and ranks which require higher levels of vetting. This policy has been in place for several years and it hasn't changed.
Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Look, figures in the Times last month showed that the British Army will shrink to as small as 67,000 by 2026 due to the current crisis in recruitment and retention. As threats to the UK are increasing, will the Minister finally commit to halting these cuts that he is continuing to make to the Army?
Well, the government is sticking to 73,000 regular and 30,000 reserve personnel, as I said earlier. Those figures were contained in Future Soldier, published in 2021, and remains unchanged.
Jack Brereton.
Number 4, Mr Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, the Ministry of Defence continues to stand ready to support the FCDO-led effort to pursue land, air, maritime routes to delivering urgently needed humanitarian aid.
Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Many of my constituents in Stoke-on-Trent South are extremely concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and want to see much more aid getting into Gaza. This is vitally needed by the innocent civilian population in Gaza. So will the Secretary of State update us on what more is being done to get additional routes into Gaza, and particularly to get a sea route for humanitarian aid into those innocent civilians?
Well, my honourable friend will be pleased to know that I've been to the region on a number of occasions, visiting Israel, Cyprus twice, Egypt, Saudi, with the specific intention of trying to resolve the problem that he describes. We've delivered 150 tonnes of aid already, but the problem is getting the aid into the country, or into Gaza, I should say. Although we've persuaded the Israelis to open Kerem Shalom, we desperately need Ashdod opened as well, and then we can create a humanitarian aid route from Cyprus, which we've discussed with the Cypriots, direct to Ashdod and straight in via Kerem Shalom.
Andrew Salu.
Number 5, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, families are an integral part of the armed forces community. Our commitment to them remains strong and reinforced through the Haythorne-Thwaite Review and Defence Command Paper and Refresh, the family strategy published in January 2022, set out this government's response, and my honourable friend's excellent Living in Our Shoes framework for delivering more family-sympathetic policies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The families of armed forces personnel have to put up with more separation, relocation and danger to their loved ones than any other public servant, and they often feel slightly disenfranchised. They might not know who their Member of Parliament is. They might fear to approach them for the impact that might have on their spouse or partner's career. So does he agree with me it's incredibly important that there is public visibility on following through on the 86 recommendations the Ministry of Defence accepted in full and the 20 which were accepted in part?
Well, Mr Speaker, I have slightly different numbers. My honourable friend will be interested to hear on the number of accepted. I have 106 out of 110 from his report. Regardless of the exact numbers, I entirely agree with him about the importance of making sure that armed forces families live in accommodation which is decent, that when we ask them to go and fight abroad, when they come home, they have good living accommodation. He'll be pleased to hear that the steering group that he'll be very familiar with, which includes families, federations and authors of my honourable friend's excellent report, meets again on the 28th of this month.
Mr Speaker, with permission, I would like to answer questions 6, 7, 12 and 19 together. In a challenging labour market, we continue to apply an array of measures to support recruitment and retention and refine the armed forces offer. These include the biggest pay rise in 20 years, flexible service and an improved accommodation offer. The Haythorne-Thwaite Review has a key part to play, and teams have been stood up across defence to implement all 67 recommendations, working to establish a reward and incentivisation architecture that will attract and retain the skills we need.
Mr Speaker, I'm very grateful for that answer. But it's also true that the quality of forces accommodation is an important factor in both recruitment and retention of the armed forces. Would my right honourable friend consider giving local commanders greater agency to get small repairs done locally if the national contractors fail to act quickly enough?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Heads of establishment can access an approved funding pot to address minor maintenance works up to a maximum value of £25,000 per item, and that's extremely helpful and gets away from some of the bureaucracy that's involved with the prime contractors.
Sarah Atherton.
Mr Mr Speaker. 7 experienced personnel are leaving to 5 being recruited. Despite efforts being placed on diversity and inclusion policies, some in my opinion being counterproductive, in addition to Capita's initiatives, last year there was a net loss of 310 servicewomen to the military. Falling rates of retention is overshadowing operational effectiveness. Can the Minister outline what he's doing for retention?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and predecessor. Over the past 2 years, Defence has put servicewomen at the heart of the development and delivery of a range of initiatives, as you well knows, from uniform policies, provision of accessible sanitary products, mentoring, the introduction of flexible service, wraparound childcare, parental leave, zero tolerance to unacceptable behaviours, and further measures in response to Wigston, Gray and my honourable friend's report. I pay tribute to those who have been driving change, but it's far from job done.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The armed forces, including the 14 signal regiments based in Pembrokeshire, continue to provide fabulous career opportunities for young people. So does my honourable friend agree with me that now more than ever we need to encourage army visits into schools, and that the long campaign by nationalists in Wales to stop those kind of visits actually damages social mobility and aspirations?
Yeah, I entirely share my right honourable friend's enthusiasm. The Armed Forces is a huge engine for social mobility. The Army achieved over 5,000 school engagement visits from across the United Kingdom in the last year, each at the school's request. The British Army is the public's army. It is important it engages with the people it serves, despite the best efforts of some on the left and the nationalists to which he refers.
Louis French.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The London Borough of Bexley is home to a number of excellent cadet and reserve units which teach vital life skills. Could the Minister please update the House on progress on the cadet expansion programme and what work is being undertaken to strengthen the pathways into His Majesty's Armed Forces?
Mr Speaker, I am very grateful for the opportunity to do so. The Joint Ministry of Defence and Department for Education Cadet Expansion Programme is progressing extremely well. We currently have over 54,000 cadets in school cadet units. The Cadet Expansion Programme has focused on growth in the state sector. Since introduction in 2012, the number of cadet units in state schools has grown by over 400%, 268 schools. Some new units have also been opened in independent schools, and here there has been a 12% increase. I'm sure my honourable friend would join me in welcoming that transformation.
Sir Strathern.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Local service personnel routinely cite to me issues in service accommodation as a big barrier to recruitment and retention. So I was really disappointed to hear that the government has no plans to improve the quality of the near 900 SLA accommodation bed spaces in my constituency at Chickstown that currently fall into the lowest grades before the base closes. Will the Minister commit to revisiting this decision to make sure we do right by all service personnel serving on the base before it closes?
The gentleman is absolutely right to highlight the importance of service accommodation. He will be aware, I hope, of the huge investment that government is putting in to not only improving the quality of service family accommodation, but also service living accommodation. Our people deserve the best. I think it's public knowledge that they have not had the best for some considerable time. We are absolutely committed to remedying that, including for his constituents.
Chairman.
Mr Speaker, doesn't the Minister wake up in the morning sometimes and check on reality? The fact of the matter is we have had seven Secretary of State for Defence since 2010, absolute turmoil in our armed forces, and the fact of the matter is, why would people join the British Army when a government like this has run us down to 72,000 serving officers? 72! I used to campaign when you took it below 100,000. Wake up and invest in the defence of our country in a troubled world.
Well, those are interesting reflections, aren't they, Mr Speaker? I suggest he has a word with his front bench, and in particular the Shadow Chancellor, who to date has failed to commit to the level of spending on the defence of this country that this party, this side, is completely committed to.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The rise of so-called woke culture has been infecting our society for many years, and it should be unsurprising that it's now infecting our military. Does the Minister think that the rise of woke makes it easier or more difficult to recruit the right sort of people into our armed forces?
Well, I completely reject the premise of my honourable friend's question. If he's talking about increasing the amount of women in our armed forces, if he's talking about the Lord Etherton's review into LGBT historically in our armed forces, if he's talking about our ambition to make our armed forces more reflective of the society from which they're drawn and which they serve, then, Mr. Speaker, I'm as guilty as charged.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Minister for his answer? Minister, you and I will be aware, and many others will be aware, that across Northern Ireland, recruitment to the services, be the Army, the RAF or the Royal Navy, was always exceptional. To ensure that that continues, the TA regiments are at a figure and a number where they can't go above. What I was suggesting, Mr. Speaker, is that maybe here the MOD and the Minister should look at a possibility of increasing those numbers of PA soldiers to ensure that the recruitment levels in Northern Ireland can exceed the numbers that are already there.
Well, I'm very grateful. It gives me the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, paying tribute to people of Northern Ireland who, as he says, have contributed disproportionately to the defence of our country. He will know that we're committed to growing our reserve forces, and of course that means reserve forces right across our United Kingdom.
Minister Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 24,000 fewer troops, 4,000 fewer sailors, 200 less aircraft, and 1 in 5 ships removed. The Conservatives have failed our armed forces over the last 14 years, missing their recruitment target every year since taking power in 2010 and hollowing out our military. Does the Minister honestly believe he can look the public in the eye and claim 5 more years will fix the mess that they have created, or is it time for a fresh start?
Oh, I think the honourable gentleman knows what I'm going to say in response to his question, and that is to invite him to have a conversation with the Shadow Chancellor to commit to the same level of spending on defence as this government is committed to and is spending right now. Is he going to make a spending commitment here and now in the House of Commons? If so, I'm all ears.
Can I also suggest it is for the government not to be asking the questions, it's for the opposition. Dame Caroline Darnage.
Mr. Speaker, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Rotary Wing Enterprise Programme seeks to improve aircraft availability across support solutions for Apache, Chinook, Merlin and Wildcat from within existing budgets. It will do so by driving synergies between platforms, modernising support solutions and pursuing delivery-focused commercial mechanisms, sir.
Caroline Dinage.
Speaker, as you know, Fleetlands in Gosport has been the home of military helicopter maintenance for over 65 years, and this highly skilled engineering work is really key to levelling up the area, providing much needed jobs and opportunity. But does the Minister agree with me that actually the MOD's Rotary Wing Enterprise and New Medium helicopter programme actually would benefit greatly from these generations of expertise and skills right there in Gosport?
Well, I know from my recent visit that my honourable friend is a champion not only for defence in her constituency, but in particular for defence jobs. She's right about Standard Aero at Fleetlands Gosport, which is a valued actor in the maintenance of our rotary wing platforms. In terms of the specific rotary wing enterprise, this is due to enter its detailed design this year, sir. As part of this, it will consider wider social value, including the extent to which economic prosperity is supported. But as this is a specific potential procurement, I cannot comment. And likewise, on new medium helicopter, we cannot comment on the role of particular companies, but we hope to say more on this very soon.
Shadow Minister Maria Riedel.
Speaker, the government's delayed producing information required for the invitation to negotiate for the new medium lift helicopter 4 times since September 2022. So can he explain what's caused this 18-month delay? And given the reports last week about his department freezing capital spending until at least the new financial year, when are the government going to get their act together to get this competition underway? Can you promise that the delay won't push back the delivery date for this vital capability for our forces?
Well, 2 things I'm pleased to say. First of all, we will have the announcement on the next stage of new medium helicopter very, very soon. And I'm pleased to also confirm that we've been clear on our spending position. Perhaps to echo my honourable friend, if the honourable lady wants to talk about stuff that's rumoured in the press and we don't have those sorts of capital spending controls, she could confirm that the Shadow Chancellor is going to honour our spending on the Ministry of Defence.
Giles Watling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 9, if you please.
Mr. Speaker, AUKUS partners continue to make very good progress on the optimal pathway to deliver conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines to Australia and to develop the advanced capabilities required.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my right honourable friend for his answer. AUKUS is a bold project which rightfully identifies the greater need for cooperation in the Pacific between our great nations. However, I don't think it should be limited to just defence. In my own report for the 1922 Foreign Affairs Policy Committee, we found that there's not only a need, but an appetite for wider scope, inclusion of Canada, for example. Does my honourable friend agree that AUKUS cannot be just about defence policy? And are we reaping the maximum benefits for Britain by consigning to this being just a defence procurement exercise? I mean, where is the FCOD in all this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to say that AUKUS can and should be a programme which extends beyond the three core nations, the UK, the US and Australia. But that is very much a matter for the Pillar 2 arrangements rather than the Pillar 1, which the House will know is the nuclear-powered submarine for Australia and that joint procurement. And he'll be pleased to hear that in, I think it was November, I was in the US signing up a programme of Pillar 2 work which could ultimately extend to others, including Canada and New Zealand.
Sir Desmond Swayne.
Cancer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Royal Navy has a range of capabilities to support the engagement of land-based targets. Specific threat planning is considered for every deployment or contingency, and measures are taken to reduce or mitigate those expected threats as dictated by operational priority.
Sir Desmond.
What urgency is attached to the upgrading of HMS Diamond's defence systems?
Well, my own friend asked an excellent question. I know that there's been a lot of interest following the deployment in the Red Sea and what the lessons are. I can confirm that the Sea Viper capability has, of course, been at the forefront of this, being the Navy's weapon of choice in the first shooting down of an aerial threat in more than 30 years. It is a cutting-edge weapon system, and I can confirm that Sea Viper will be upgraded to further enhance its capability against the more complex and evolving threats we face, including the ability to intercept missiles in their terminal phase.
Lawrence Robertson.
Question number 11, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the year 22-23, the Ministry of Defence spent £25 billion with UK industry. The most recent estimate shows this supported 209,000 jobs across the country, of which 47,000 were in manufacturing, sir.
Lawrence Robertson.
Thank the Minister for that response. My Tewkesbury constituency contains a lot of aerospace manufacturing, particularly for the defence sectors, but those companies have long complained to me that they can't attract enough young people into their companies, particularly to take engineering jobs. The All-Party Parliamentary Group, which I'm co-chairman of, has as its objective to entice young people into engineering, or at least to consider it as a career. Is there anything more the government can do to persuade young people to consider taking up engineering opportunities, which are there?
Well, my honourable friend asked an excellent question. I think it helps that we have lots of schools and young people in the gallery today, being half-term, but I can confirm that last year's Defence Command paper identifies skills as a priority, including the shortage of engineering, digital, cyber, STEM subjects, nuclear and space-based skills. The Defence Head of Profession for Engineering, who also supports the Government Science and Engineering Head of Profession, has a Defence Youth Engagement Strategy that drives STEM outreach activities and the encouragement of engineering uptake in individuals aged 4 to 14. Sir.
13, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everything I'd intended to say in response to the honourable gentleman was covered in the supplementary to question 2.
Richard Board, why wasn't he grouped then?
May said of NATO that it existed, amongst other things, to keep the Soviet Union out and the Americans in. The Foreign Secretary was misunderstood on a recent visit to the United States when he proposed that Congress should pass a new military aid package for Ukraine, and he was rebuffed by some Republicans in the House of Representatives. What can the Defence Secretary do to encourage the US to maintain its commitment to Ukraine and to NATO?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, we covered this earlier, but it's an important issue. The Secretary of State, me, other ministers from the MOD, and indeed from across the whole of government, put our shoulder to the wheel whenever we are in Washington, not only to impress on the US the importance of its continued commitment to Ukrainian security, but also that Euro-Atlantic security is integral to US security, and that the US cannot simply look towards the Pacific. It needs to remain engaged in the Euro-Atlantic in its own interests, as well as those of NATO allies.
General Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On my last visit to Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, I had several meetings with Ukrainian government ministers who voiced their frustration and their concern about the delay in setting up joint operations with UK defence manufacturers. Is there anything that can I ask my honourable friend to assure the House that he's doing everything possible to speed this process up to allow the Ukrainians to produce their own kit with our help so that they can help in the war?
Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State and the Minister for Defence Procurement have both been heavily engaged in this. Indeed, the Minister for Defence Procurement led a delegation to Kyiv to catalyse exactly the idea that the honourable gentleman mentions.
Number 14, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The MOD has already started its decarbonisation journey in support of the UK's net zero commitment. At the Royal International Air to 2 last year, I was pleased to sign the Defence Net Zero Aviation Charter on behalf of MOD. Working closely with our industrial partners, we are moving to cleaner and more efficient technology. The Army is building solar farms and invested £14 million in battlefield electrification. The Royal Navy's cutting-edge catalytic systems are reducing emissions of greenhouse gases in its patrol vessels by up to 97%. And finally, Mr Speaker, the RAF is pioneering the use of sustainable aviation fuel.
Mr Speaker, it was a pleasure to attend the Global Charge Dinner last October to see so many members of the armed forces from all ranks committed to tackling the climate crisis. However, the Defence Select Committee has described the MOD's carbon reduction targets as insufficiently demanding under the greening government commitments. They are the lowest across all government. Will the Minister ensure that the next round of CC commitments will contain more demanding targets, not least to reflect the real ambitions for the members of the armed forces on the ground to see the devastation of climate change?
Here, here. Well, I mean, the Honourable Lady makes... I know she's very passionate about this. What I would stress to her, I've just listed the ways in which the individual services are taking steps to reduce their emissions. But, of course, we have to always balance that against our overwhelming priorities department, which is to support the ability of our armed forces to defend these islands.
Yes, absolutely.
Sheffield Lee.
Dearne, sir.
Mr Speaker, Defence is investing over £6.6 billion in advanced research and development, working with UK industry and academia to identify and invest in innovative technologies, ensuring we have the capabilities we need to defeat our adversaries.
Sir Edward.
Traditionally, the RAF has a very poor record when it closes its bases in Lincolnshire, just walking away and leaving to rack and ruin. But this time, we had wonderful schemes for RAF Scampton in terms of defence innovative technology, such as a spaceport. Will the Minister now work with the Home Office and myself to try and release the bulk of this base so that we can get all these exciting technologies going? The MOD can't just wash its hands of this base now that it's passed it to the Home Office. We're supposed to have joined-up government.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point. What I would state to him is obviously RAF, as he knows, is no longer part of the defence estate. It means we don't have that formal responsibility for it. What I would stress to him is that we are investing in innovation in Lincolnshire, including, for example, the significant investment into Waddington associated with our Protector capability.
Patrick Grady.
Mr Speaker, number 16.
Worth every penny.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I apologise. The Dreadnought submarine programme remains within overall budget and on track for the first-of-class HMS Dreadnought to enter service in the early 2030s. Inflation has remained higher than expected for an extended period and has had an adverse impact on the cost forecast for the programme when compared to the forecast from a year earlier. As the programme is in its preliminary phases, it is too early to provide cost estimates for the replacement warhead programme.
Patrick Grady.
Speaker, I think what that means is the Minister doesn't know what the total lifetime cost of Trident replacement is going to be. Budgets in government departments and household alike are under immense pressure because of rampant inflation. So why does everybody else's budget have to be under pressure, but the blank cheque seems to be the approach to the renewal of Trident?
Well, it's an extraordinary thing to say by the Honourable Gentleman. He knows we will shortly be publishing, before the end of the financial year, our supplementary estimate for the defence nuclear enterprise for the financial year. But as he knows, there's a cost in not having a deterrent. That is his policy, to do away with the deterrent on a unilateral basis, despite all the terrible threats we can see in the world and the nuclear sabre rattling from Russia. His policy would be abject folly. We will invest in providing that ultimate guarantee to the people of the United Kingdom.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the Minister and most of the House, leaving aside the Scottish National benches, would agree with me that continuous at-sea deterrence is an absolutely central part of the defence of the realms. No question about that at all. And would you all agree with me that we must find a way of replacing Trident within budget, and the worst possible thing that could possibly occur to Trident would be an SNP government in Scotland?
I agree 100% with my honourable friend.
We now come to Topicals. Greg Smith.
Mr. Speaker, this year I visited the United States, the White House and Capitol Hill, to lobby on behalf of Ukraine, as discussed today, Saudi Arabia and Egypt for the crisis in the Middle East, HMS Diamond to thank the ship's crew, and also our sovereign base at Akrotiri to thank the Typhoon pilots. The Cyprus itself was also visited. And last week I was in Brussels at NATO and Munich for the security conference. The whole House will know that defence never sleeps and will wish to join me in thanking the brave men and women who make that possible.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend update the House on progress made at the NATO Defence Ministers' meeting, in particular regard to support for Ukraine?
Indeed, I can. Alongside the NATO meeting was actually the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, which is 52 countries, all of whom support Ukraine. The big concern, of course, is to make sure that Ukraine both has the things it needs now, but also the planning to make sure that in 2024 it can both sustain and push back the fight against the enemy. And that is why the work that this country does, in particular in drones, where I announced £200 million, together with a 15-nation coalition for multinational procurement. That's an initiative called MPI, and also welcomed Australia at my request, who've joined us in the International Fund for Ukraine with $50 million for a fund which is now worth $900 million.
Secretary of State John Healey.
Mr. Speaker, the agonies of the Palestinian people are extreme. We all want to fight. They want the fighting to stop now. Hostages returned now, aid ramped up now, and a ceasefire that lasts permanently. What is the Defence Secretary doing to help his Israeli counterpart accept that their threatened offensive against Rafah just cannot happen?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with the right honourable gentleman about the seriousness of the situation, and as he's just heard, I visited Israel actually just before the new year and had these conversations direct. I believe that it's both in Israel's interest, obviously Gaza's interest, and the world's interest to see this immediate cessation followed by a permanent ceasefire. We are doing everything that we can to both persuade the Israelis of that necessity, but also put pressure on Hamas, who still hold hostages. If they were to release them, this thing could finish very quickly. We're also helping by ensuring that we are working on plans for what happens in the north of the country, or southern Lebanon as well.
Speaker, Carshall and Wallington is home to over 1,700 veterans who have and continue to provide amazing service to our great nation. So could the Secretary of State please update me into what steps we are taking as a government to provide better support for veterans in our country?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Since 2011, the Armed Forces Covenant and its consequentials have been the absolute linchpin for public commitment to those who have served, and it has materially improved the lived experience of the service community. The MOD is responsible for a number of services for veterans. The Veterans Welfare Service, for example, supports around 50,000 veterans every year, and the Office for Veterans Affairs coordinates across government to advance support for veterans and their families.
Shadow Minister Steve McCabe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the number of veterans claiming welfare benefits rising steadily and more than 52,000 now in receipt of universal credit, does the Minister find this a cause for celebration or concern?
I am a veteran, Mr. Speaker. I talk to veterans all the time, as does my right honourable friend who heads up the Office of Veterans Affairs, and I don't recognise the picture that he has described. We have, since 2011, materially improved the lived experience of our veteran community and their families, and we will continue to do that. Of that you can be absolutely sure.
Sarah Atherton.
when defence contract bids are awarded, there's a 10 to 20% weighting given to social value. Social value being the benefit that that contract would have to the local and wider community. Could the Minister clarify that this community benefit is entirely for the UK, or are overseas companies and their communities considered equally to the UK?
So it's a very good question, my honourable friend. I think the distinction here, Mr. Speaker, is between the Cabinet Office social value rules, which are applied across government and which are irrespective, and the rules that we apply as the Ministry of Defence for our procurements, which, if, for example, there was discussion of new medium helicopter earlier, when that comes out, as I hope it will soon, it will be clear that we are looking to incentivise a strong commitment to the UK industrial base.
Alyn Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The MOD recently published the findings of the inquiry into the fatal accident involving a scimitar fighting vehicle on Salisbury Plain, in which a young soldier tragically lost his life. One of my constituents was witness to the accident, which has inevitably had a profound impact on him. The government has said that it doesn't plan to make a formal response to the inquiry report, which is a harrowing read, but it has accepted all 52 recommendations. Doesn't the Minister think it requires a full and formal response from the government with a detailed action plan for adopting the 52 recommendations, given the seriousness of the incident and the wider implications for our...
Order. Please, just remember it is topic, because I've got to get other members in.
Mr. Speaker, very simply, I actually read the report and, as she rightly points out, accepted all of the findings. We don't usually take it further, but I'll certainly be happy to take a look at the case she raises.
Well, Francois.
Thank you, sir. On the subject of recruitment and retention, on the 7th of November, the Chief of the General Staff, Patrick Sanders, arguably the best general of his generation, told the Defence Committee the following, and I quote, "We are taking 400 soldiers out of the field army to put them alongside recruiters because, guess what? It takes a soldier to recruit a soldier." Never a truer word was spoken. So when are we finally going to sack capital?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his question. I knew he'd get capita in there somewhere. He will be familiar with Engage to Recruit, which is a programme that's currently underway and has having some success in getting soldiers to recruit soldiers. That's probably why, as I touched upon in my earlier answer, we are seeing now some extremely promising recruiting figures, including in January the best figures for 6 years.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Israel so far has ignored international appeals not to attack indiscriminately civilians and not to take steps which are basically raising Gaza to the ground. It now looks as it's going to ignore international opinion about entering Rafah. So has it not now time come for us to consider not selling arms to Israel, which can be used in these totally unacceptable ways?
Well, Mr. Speaker, arms deals and export licences are dealt with in the normal way, but the honourable member will be interested to hear that actually there's not very much arms sales in the direction of Israel that takes place at all. Off the top of my head, I think it was just £42 million last year, and it was mostly protective equipment.
Late last year, diesel got into the water supply at the Trenchard Lines camp near Upavon in my constituency, and I commend the resilience of the families that live there and also of the MOD, which acted very quickly to ensure there was a temporary supply of water. They're still living on that temporary supply, so can the Minister assure me that attention is being given to sorting out this problem and ensuring a permanent supply of clean water?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. He's a champion of the defence community in his constituency. I'm grateful for his early engagement on this. As I understand, following completion of rigorous testing by the local authority regulator, they've confirmed the water quality at Trenchard Lines is acceptable. And as I understand, it is now safe for personnel working and living there to use the main supply. But I will double check and will write to him. But I'm grateful for his comments on the performance of DIO in this regard.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen news today of another serious attack by the Houthis on a commercial vessel in the Gulf of Aden. Do ministers think that more Royal Navy ships will need to be deployed to the region given the ongoing threat to merchant shipping?
Well, the honourable gentleman will be familiar with the answers I gave, I think, last week or the week before at the dispatch box, where I said that we will always look at what's happening in the sea, in the Red Sea. I've been there to meet the crews myself. and we'll make a judgment based on the reality on the ground. We do know, and we welcome now the input from a conglomeration of EU countries who are coming to join Prosperity Guardian as well.
Sir Julian.
The debate on the Red Sea on 24th of January, I asked for confirmation that HMS Albion and HMS Bulwark would not only not be scrapped, but would not be mothballed either. The Deputy Foreign Secretary with the Secretary of State alongside him said in response that I was absolutely right to detect the supportive view of the Secretary of State for Defence. However, a journalist subsequently was told that nothing had changed by the Ministry of Defence. So are these ships going to be mothballed or not?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend can rest easy. I've actually been down since those questions, visited HMS Albion. I can confirm that one of those ships will always be being made ready to sail, and I think he can therefore be very relieved.
Ms. Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Suicide rates amongst veterans under 24 years old are 2 to 4 times as high as in the civilian population. But figures show that this group is less likely to be in touch with mental health services. How will the Minister ensure that young veterans can access the support they need?
Grateful for the question, and she's been consistent in her inquiry into this matter. She'll be reassured to know that across the service community, the rate of suicide is lower than we would expect in the civilian population. There is a subset within the serving population among young men where there is an excess, and we're looking very closely at that. And I very much commend to her the suicide action plan that we have published, which lays out what Defence is doing to drive down the suicide rate in our armed forces. Whichever figure it is too high.
James Gray.
Speaker, the whole House, I think, would like to see a larger Army, Navy and Air Force. Thanks for unanimity on that particular point. And central to that must be the Armed Force Recruitment Programme, but also the Army Centralised Training Scheme. Will my honourable friend confirm to me that the pause, which was announced last week in the press, in capital spending of the MOD will not affect those two schemes, and they will continue in as full-blooded a way as they are at the moment?
Yeah. My right honourable friend would be pleased to know there is no pause. The approvals are flowing.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Royal Navy carriers HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales entered service respectively 6 and 7 years late and cost more than 20 times the cost of Scotland's ferries, rocketing to over £8,000 million and plagued with problems and a lack of actual aircraft. What assurances can we have that these hugely expensive carriers will provide the defence capability for which they were designed?
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole House recognises the irony of an SNP spokesman talking to us about ships being delivered late. I think the whole House will want to welcome the extraordinary work done by those on HMS Prince of Wales who got the ship ready to leave, not at 30 days readiness, which is what they were ranked for, but in 8 days. And I would have thought congratulating the ship's company would be the right thing to do.
Very Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, does the Secretary of State remember that the British Army used to be the biggest trainer of young men and women in the country? We produced so many skilled people. When can he take us back to those balmy days?
Secretary of State.
Well, we have been training since 2014 60,000 Ukrainian troops, proving that we know how to get troops trained. We still train extraordinary numbers, and I think I'm right in saying when it comes to the broader link through to all of the forms of training, we are breaking some of those records as well. We're going to ensure that we have armed forces who are fit for the 21st century.
That completes questions.